They claim giants don't feel the cold, that their bones are too thick, their hearts too callous to sense the wind tearing at their flesh or the quiet shaking through vacant cabins. Silas Cade knew better, though. 30 winters old, as tall as the barn he never completed. He'd come to sense cold in spots where no flame could penetrate. His cabin hugged the tip of Widow's Bluff, where the horizon fractured like a pledge broken. Made of solid pine and somber sorrow, every plank had been driven by the same hands that had cradled his brother in his deathbed fever, and released him. The porch hung low with years of storms he never took the time to repair. The windows looked out like tired eyes that had seen too much and asked for no more. Nights most often, Silas didn't bother using a lantern. He sat in darkness, a hot cup held tight in his hand that always chilled before he took a sip. Boots untied, jaw clenched, watching over the rusting gears of his own heart. He talked to no one, not the birds, not the deer, and not to God. People down in Juniper Hollow hushed that he'd gone silent from shame. The reality was easier. He had nothing left to say. So when there was a knock on his door about the time the sun began to set, he wrote it off as wind. But when it came again, soft, shuddering, he got up slow, like a bear awakened from hibernation. On the other side wasn't a tempest, nor a bill collector, but a girl. No more than 23, braids undone and wind-blown, a tattered blue shawl wrapped about thin shoulders. Dust powdered her cheeks. Her feet were bare. She started, and then swallowed hard, her voice no louder than a whisper. Just until dawn. Please. She was standing in his doorway. She was backlit by the shadowy soft light of the fire. Her gaze flickered past his figure toward warmth, her body shuddering in his darkness. He remained silent. Not yet, he finally growled. She winced, half turned away until he moved aside. She swept into the cabin as if accustomed to being rebuffed. He gave her neither welcome nor greeting, merely a stool in the firelight and a thin quilt folded at its base. She wrapped it around her and sat cross-legged, watching the flames. Her face told stories she did not tell, and silence spoke of a life where excuses merely bred more pain. Silas stepped quietly across the room, as though one misstep would break something delicate. He filled a worn cup with hot water, added sage and mint, and placed it within reach of her hands. She blinked at the action, and then nodded ever so slightly. "Thanks," she whispered. He leaned forward and settled into his chair across from her. The fire crackled. The wind clawed at the cabin walls. She drank her tea with shaking hands. Afterwards, when the flames died down to coals, she huddled under the quilt on the floor. Silas didn't sleep. He stared at the fire, and for the first time in years he didn't feel alone. Dawn, she was still there. Neither of them said a word. She swabbed the floor with a bunch of willow twigs, boiled wild roots into a broth that tasted like rain-washed soil. 2 days went by before he found out her name. Tan. New moon. Appropriate, he thought, for someone who had crept into his existence without light, but altered every tide in it. On the third morning, she laid down a black and white feather on the table, ceremonial, sharp-edged. He did not inquire as to its meaning. He merely nodded. She knew. By the end of the week, the people in town noticed. Juniper Hollow was one of those towns where word spread as quickly as wheat and salt. Reverend Amos Grady saw Tan purchasing flour at Magaloo Crane's shop and resolved to pass sentence that Sunday. "She's a stranger," Grady cautioned, his tone heavy with righteousness. "You know what people will say, what they're saying already." Silas stared up at the cross over the pulpit, as if it would provide an answer the Reverend never would. The next night, Tan sat beside him on the porch beneath weary, blinking stars. She cradled a tin mug in her hands and whispered, "I can leave." He gazed at her, truly looked. Her eyes weren't begging. They were steeled for departure. He got up, ducked into the cabin, and emerged with a blanket folded in his hand. His mother's, softened by years of use and mended by memory. He placed the blanket around her shoulders and sat back in his chair. It was a tiny act, but at that instant the ground seemed to tilt between them. The second visitor arrived mid-morning, the sheriff. Doyle rode up with the deliberate, plodding pace of a man accustomed to being obeyed, the hooves of his horse striking the ground like the rhythm of authority. He doffed his hat, more habit than deference. "Good morning, Cade," he announced. "I hear you've got guests." Silas was on the porch, arms crossed. Tan was brewing juniper inside. "She's not causing problems," added the sheriff, looking towards the window. "But you know how people are. Jittery. Perhaps it would be best if she departed." Silas remained silent. "Just consider it," Doyle grumbled before slapping his reins and riding away. When the dust had cleared, Tan got up onto the porch with him. "You want me to leave?" she asked. He shook his head, slowly, and in that stillness she smiled for the first time. Days filtered into a pace too soft to describe. She taught him how to start ghost peppers in shallow clay, how to dry herbs over the chimney. He repaired the porch stairs. She patched his shirts. They didn't touch, didn't admit. But with each exchanged look, something frayed started mending itself back together. One night, a low melody came from her mouth, winding through the cabin like smoke. Old and mournful, it unwound something inside him. "What song is that?" he asked, his voice grating with disuse. "My mother's," she said quietly. "She sang it when she brought my brother across the plains. He died." Silas sat, his hands knotting into fists. "I had a brother," he whispered. "Elias. Fever got him while I was in town. For whiskey." Tan observed him, eyes impassive. They said nothing more that night. They did not need to. The next morning, Silas etched a marker for Elias and set it behind the cabin, next to the tree where birds made nests. Tan set the black and white feather at its base. As the days dragged out, the garden flourished. She instructed him in reading the sky, listening for the wind's whispers. He instructed her in whittling flutes out of cedar and laying snares for rabbits. She sang. He heard. But there is no peace where terror holds sway. They arrived at dusk, a dozen men, Doyle leading, Reverend Grady one step back of him. Faces hardened, eyes ravenous for power. "Get out of the way, Cade," Doyle commanded, his hand on his belt. "We're taking her. She's a thief, a drifter. You hear the stories." "She's my woman," Silas said, the words spilling out of him like thunder in an arid sky. Tan moved forward behind him, her voice firm. "I'm not yours." Silas shifted his head.
"No."
"But you're not theirs either." The air froze. Grady lifted a hand. "You'd sacrifice your name for her?" Silas's eyes ran over them, as solid as falling snow. "I already have, when I stood by while my brother died." The crowd moved restlessly. "She remains," Silas told them, his tone flat and uncompromising. "And if you return, come prepared." They stood for a moment, then turned, each one of them, until only dust remained in their trail. That evening, Tan danced shoeless in the yard, shawl rippling like water in the moonlight. Her arms were open to the wind, and she did not dance to be seen, but to take up space in a world that had sought to remove her. Silas stood on the porch, his chest constricted, his hands loose at his sides. When she turned to him, he nodded once. And for the first time since his fire had died out, he smiled. They didn't love each other as the fairy tales describe. No declarations of love. No kisses under the stars. Rather, she left tea next to his boots at dawn. He whittled her name into a cedar flute. She left wildflowers by Elias's monument. He inquired as to what her mother's voice was like. Small gestures, quiet acts of mercy. They were constructing something not out of necessity but out of will. And the wind, that venerable guardian of secrets, learned their names and bore them gently down the valley. I'm telling you this not because it's uncommon, but because it's true. Because goodness can persist in abandoned places. Because even giants feel shame. Even travelers need rest. And sometimes the new moon arrives when the heart has finally prepared itself to start.